Previously on Part 1. In the summer of 1981, a 9-year-old boy named Marcus Cole was driven down Highway 61 by his father Raymond, handed to a stranger on a gravel road, and left there for $800. For 7 years, Marcus worked Harold Dunbar's farm in the Mississippi Delta, 6 days a week, before dawn, in heat that never let up and silence that never broke. He taught himself algebra and accounting from books a man named Walter pressed into his hands without explanation. He drew blueprints in the dirt with a stick. He held on to the only thing Harold Dunbar could never reach, which was his mind. And then in April of 1988, the Mississippi River flooded, the farm went into chaos, and Marcus Cole walked away. 8 miles in the rain to a rail yard, a freight car with an open door, a train moving north, 16 years old, alone. And for the first time in 7 years, free. He had a body that could work. He had a mind that had been working in secret for 7 years. He had the accumulated discipline of a person who has been required, by the specific demands of his situation, to never stop moving forward regardless of the available resources for moving forward. And he had, as he would tell the journalist interviewer in 2021, one more thing that he is careful to name precisely when he describes it. He had no fear. He is careful to explain that the absence of fear was not courage in the conventional sense, not the overcoming of fear through will or character. It was the literal absence, the way a person who has lost everything has lost also the fear of losing things, because the fear of loss requires the prior existence of something to lose. And Marcus Cole, sitting in that freight car with the Delta rain on the roof and the train moving north, did not have anything left that could be taken. What he had could not be taken. And that turned out to be more than enough. Chicago in April of 1988 was cold in a way that Marcus Cole, who had spent his entire life in the Mississippi Delta, was not prepared for, and cold in a way that the thin farm work clothes he was wearing were not designed to address. The city rose around him when he got off the train at the freight yard on the south side, brick and steel, and the elevated train tracks, and the particular urban density of a major American city, which is nothing like the flat, open spaces Marcus had lived in his entire life, and which required an immediate and complete recalibration of everything from how you moved through space, to how you assessed threat, to how you navigated toward the basic necessities. He was 16 years old and he looked, in those farm work clothes, exactly like what he was, someone who had come from somewhere rural and hard and recent, and who had not yet acquired the protective coloring of the city. The first days were the hardest days of what had been, already, a hard life, and Marcus has said very little about them in the years since, only enough to communicate that he navigated them using every resource he had, and that none of those resources was luck. He found a church shelter that asked no questions. He found a diner on the south side that needed a dishwasher and paid under the table and asked nothing about documentation or age. He found a boarding house that cost almost everything the diner paid, but provided a door with a lock and a surface to sleep on. And 4 blocks from the boarding house, which he identified on the second day and visited every subsequent day that his schedule allowed, was a Chicago public library that was large and warm and free, and stocked with more books than Marcus had access to in all the years on the farm combined. The library was where Marcus Cole rebuilt himself, in the formal sense, from the foundation up. He had the accounting and finance framework that the farm years had given him. Now he had access to everything that built on top of that framework: advanced finance texts, real estate investment manuals, business law, economic history, the biographies and case studies of American companies, and the people who built them. He read with the appetite of someone who has been rationing food for years and has suddenly been placed in front of a full table, but his appetite was not undisciplined. It was structured, sequential, building systematically from what he already knew toward what he needed to know next. He cross-referenced. He took notes on whatever paper he could find. He ran the concepts against each other and against his own observations and against the framework he had built across those 7 years in the Delta. And the framework held, and the new material integrated with it. And by the time Marcus was 17, and then 18, the person sitting at that library table in the late afternoon light was someone who understood the structural mechanics of American finance and real estate at a level that most people only reach after years of formal education and professional experience. What he had compared to those people was no credential, no network, no documented history, and a self-constructed expertise that was deep and precise and completely invisible to any system that was designed to assess human capital through conventional signals. The problem of the credential, the formal documentation that the professional world uses to sort who gets through the door first, was the problem Marcus faced when he had learned everything the library had to teach him and needed to find a way to apply it. He solved that problem the way he solved every problem, which is by observing the system carefully and finding the specific crack that a person with his particular combination of assets could push through. He had been in Chicago for 3 years when he became a mailroom clerk at a commercial office building in the city's financial district, a position that came after a succession of other positions. The diner, a delivery job, a stock clerk role at a financial printing firm, each of which had moved him incrementally closer to the environment where the work he actually wanted to do was being done. The mailroom position put him inside the building. It put him in the corridors and the elevators and the loading areas adjacent to the floors where financial firms did business, and it gave him, every day, dozens of small interactions with the people who worked in those firms. The way that invisible service roles always give their occupants a detailed and underestimated view of the people they serve. Marcus observed those people with the same systematic attention he had given to everything since the age of 9, and he understood something about the professional world from that observation that was not in any of the books. That expertise is only partly about what you know, and that a very large part of it is about communicating what you know in the specific register that the professional world recognizes and responds to, and that this register could be learned the way anything else could be learned, which was by careful observation and deliberate practice. He was working on both when the elevator encounter with Derek Whitfield happened, in the fall of 1991, on a slow elevator in that same building, with a stack of files between them and a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and changed everything. Derek Whitfield was a mid-level analyst at a real estate investment firm called Greenway Partners on the 22nd floor, a Black American man in his early 30s who had come up through a conventional educational and professional path, business school, entry-level analyst positions, the standard ladder, and who had, beneath the conventional trajectory, an uncommon quality of openness to unexpected things. When Marcus took half his files in the lobby and they got in the elevator together, Derek's initial question, "Do you work in this building?" was the kind of filler question people ask in elevators, and Marcus's answer was the kind of answer that was designed, consciously or not, to open a different kind of conversation. When Derek asked what Marcus wanted to be doing, Marcus told him, and then Derek asked what he knew about real estate finance, and Marcus told him that too, in 4 minutes, with the precision and the density of someone who has been waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate what they know and who is not going to waste it with hedging or qualification. When Marcus stopped talking, Derek stood in the lobby for a moment with his files and said, "Where did you go to school?" And Marcus said, "I didn't." And Derek said, "Come up to 22 on your lunch break on Thursday and talk to my boss." And Marcus said, "Okay." And that was it. 4 minutes in an elevator. The kind of thing that looks, in retrospect, like luck, and that is in fact the product of years of preparation arriving at the moment when the preparation can be used. Hal Preston, the founder of Greenway Partners, was a compact and busy man who had been in the Chicago real estate market for 20 years, and who had the specific intelligence of someone who has spent 2 decades navigating a competitive environment by being better at assessing people than his competitors were. He gave Marcus a test, not a formal written exam, but the kind of assessment that experienced operators use, which is to put a real problem in front of a person and watch how they think. The problem was a cash flow analysis for a strip mall acquisition that Greenway was considering. Hal gave Marcus an hour and a legal pad and the available documents and left him to it. When he came back, Marcus had produced an analysis that identified 2 structural problems with the deal that Hal's own team had not flagged, and proposed a restructured approach that was, as Hal later described it to Derek, Not entirely right, but so close to right, working from incomplete information without access to the full file, that the gap between Marcus's analysis and a correct one was smaller than the gap between Hal's team's analysis and the problem they had missed entirely. Hal offered Marcus a job as an analysis and data clerk at a modest salary. Marcus accepted and told Hal, with the directness that had worked in the elevator, that he did not have formal documentation, that he was working on addressing that, and that in the meantime his work would establish his value more clearly than a credential would. Hal Preston, who had grown up in circumstances that were not, by several important measures, entirely dissimilar to Marcus's own, and who had a highly developed instinct for capability regardless of its packaging, hired Marcus anyway. He told Marcus to get his paperwork sorted as quickly as possible and never asked another question about his background. It was a decision that would, over the following decade, prove to be among the best Hal Preston ever made. Marcus worked at Greenway Partners for 3 years with an intensity that became something the firm's other employees referenced when they described their own work ethic, in the way that people reference a standard that has been set by someone they cannot quite match. He arrived before anyone else and stayed later. He asked questions that were better than the questions people with far more experience were asking. He had a read on properties, on their value, their trajectory, the financial structure that would make an acquisition work. That was consistently more accurate than the models the firm's analysts were running, and he ran it in his head, which produced in the people around him a respect that was tinged with something close to awe, because what Marcus was doing looked, from the outside, like intuition. And intuition in a field as empirical as real estate finance reads, as a kind of gift that people tend to describe in terms that are more mystical than the reality merits. The reality was not mystical. The reality was 7 years of intensive pattern recognition, applied to a field that Marcus had been studying systematically for years before anyone gave him the opportunity to apply it professionally. The appearance of intuition was the appearance of a person whose preparation had been so thorough that the gap between perception and analysis had effectively closed. By 1994, Marcus had his documentation in order, a process that had required the navigation of bureaucratic systems with the same methodical patience he brought to every other problem, and that produced a documented identity that was his own and legal, and that closed the administrative gap between what he was and what the world required before it would formally acknowledge what he was. He began, quietly and without announcement to anyone at Greenway, to invest the money he was saving from his salary into distressed residential and small commercial properties on Chicago's south and west sides, in neighborhoods that his observation and analysis identified as undervalued, and that were showing the early structural indicators, the kind that precede visible improvement by 3 to 5 years, and that most investors miss because they are not close enough to the territory to see them. His reads were right. The properties appreciated. He reinvested. He brought Derek Whitfield in as a partner on several of the larger transactions because Derek had developed his own analytical capabilities in the years since the elevator encounter and had a gift for the relationship side of real estate transactions, the ability to read a room and build trust with sellers and lenders and partners, that Marcus acknowledged he did not possess in the same natural degree. They worked well together in the complementary way that two people work well when they bring different and roughly equal strengths to the same goal. And by 1997, they had enough capital, track record, and credibility to do something that neither of them could have done at Greenway. They founded Meridian Capital Systems in 1997, which was either the best possible timing or very nearly the worst possible timing, depending on which part of the subsequent story you weight most heavily. The company occupied the intersection of real estate investment and financial data analytics, a position that Marcus had been watching coalesce for years, observing the way that the emerging technology of the late 1990s was beginning to transform the management and analysis of financial data in ways that would make the people who understood both the technology and the underlying financial reality extraordinarily valuable. Meridian offered data analytics and investment optimization tools to mid-sized real estate operators, companies big enough to benefit significantly from better information, but too small to maintain their own technology infrastructure. It was exactly the right idea, and Marcus and Derek had exactly the right combination of credibility and track record to attract the early clients who would prove the model. The company grew fast in 1997 and 1998, riding the enormous wave of capital and enthusiasm that the late 1990s technology boom was generating across every sector it touched. By 1999, Meridian had 40 employees, a client list expanding every quarter, and a valuation that reflected the boom's enthusiasm more than any sober assessment of the underlying business. Marcus watched all of this with a quality of detachment that surprised Derek and confused the investors, who expected a founder to be emotionally aligned with his company's rising valuation. Marcus was not. He had read enough economic history and observed enough market cycles, even in his compressed and unconventional financial education, to recognize the pattern he was living inside, and the pattern looked to him like a conclusion approaching rather than a beginning still unfolding. The dot-com bubble collapsed in 2000 with the particular comprehensive devastation of a correction that has been delayed past the point where it can be gradual. Meridian lost 60% of its valuation in 18 months. 3 of its largest clients went under. 2 major investors wanted out. Derek was under severe pressure from the investor community and told Marcus plainly that they should consider taking whatever exit was available before conditions deteriorated further. Marcus Cole did not agree, and the way he did not agree is one of the things that the people who have watched his career most closely cite when they try to explain how he became what he became. He went to the investors who wanted out and made a case, calm, detailed, built entirely on numbers and structural analysis rather than optimism or narrative, that the technology and the underlying financial logic that Meridian was built on had not changed because the capital markets had repriced technology stocks. He said that the assets of the failed companies around them could now be acquired at a fraction of their replacement cost, and that the clients who survived the downturn would need Meridian's capabilities more, not less, as they navigated a more complicated investment environment with less internal capacity to do their own analysis. Some investors followed him. Others took their exit, and Marcus bought out their positions at the distressed prices those exits produced. He acquired the data systems and client relationships of 3 competitors who had failed. He cut the company's cost structure to what the business actually needed rather than what a venture-funded growth company was expected to spend. And then he did the thing that is hardest to do when a market is contracting and your investors are nervous and your competitors are dying around you, which was to wait, with patience and without panic, for the structural logic of his position to play out in the market's own time. He waited 3 years. 3 years of running the company on tight margins, updating his analysis as new information arrived, maintaining the conviction that the business was correctly positioned for a reality that had not yet arrived in the market's pricing. In 2003, the surviving companies in real estate and financial technology began growing again, and Meridian's expanded capabilities, its customer relationships, and its cost structure made it a far more attractive acquisition target than it would have been at the peak of the boom. Marcus sold Meridian in the spring of 2003 for $212 million. He was 31 years old. It was the first time his name appeared in any significant financial publication, and it appeared without his background, without his history, without any of the context that made the number not just large but extraordinary. The number was just a number, in the reporting one self-made businessman's liquidity event among the many that the post-crash consolidation period produced. Only Marcus knew what the number was built on. Only Marcus knew what the foundation looked like. And Marcus, characteristically, said very little about it. What came after the Meridian sale is the portion of the story that the financial world is most familiar with, because it is the portion that produced a public record large enough to be tracked and analyzed and written about. Marcus took the Meridian proceeds and reinvested them with the same systematic discipline he had applied at every prior stage, building a holding company called Meridian Group that expanded across real estate technology, financial data services, and eventually into direct investment in the kinds of distressed and undervalued real, estate markets that Marcus had been reading since his days of investing his Greenway partner's salary. By 2010, Meridian Group employed over 4,000 people across 8 cities. By 2015, the number was more than 6,000 across 11 cities. By 2019, the company was valued at $3.4 billion. Marcus Cole was listed among the 50 wealthiest individuals in the United States by Forbes magazine, and he was testifying before the Senate Finance Committee on FinTech regulation in language so precise and so informed that the committee chair described him afterward as one of the most prepared witnesses the committee had heard in a decade. He gave to education charities with a consistency and a generosity that went largely unreported because he gave without press releases. He contributed, anonymously, and through structures that kept his name entirely clear of the transaction, to causes in Mississippi that addressed the specific kinds of poverty and institutional dysfunction that he had grown up inside of. He said almost nothing publicly about where he had come from. When journalists asked, his publicist issued a statement that was factually accurate and entirely incomplete. It described his Mississippi childhood, his self-education, his arrival in Chicago, his early career. What it did not describe was the gravel road and the $800 and the 7 years and the bunkhouse and Walter and the dirt blueprints and the lie that Harold Dunbar told a 9-year-old boy about his father's love. That story stayed buried until the fall of 2019, when Diane Thornton, a financial journalist at Bloomberg who was writing a profile of Marcus for a cover piece on self-made fintech billionaires, started pulling on a thread that turned out to be attached to everything. Diane Thornton was 38 years old in 2019 and had been a financial journalist for 15 years, and the quality that distinguished her from many financial journalists of comparable experience and talent was a thoroughness that was structural rather than temperamental, not a personality trait that she applied when she felt like it, but a professional method that ran automatically and that she trusted even when it was producing results that were inconvenient for the story she had expected to write. She started her profile of Marcus Cole the way she started every profile, by assigning her assistant to compile the complete documentary record of everything publicly known about her subject's background and to verify each element against primary sources. The assistant came back with a report that was unusual in a specific and notable way. The record before 1990 was thin. Not absent, there were enough pieces to construct the outline of a childhood in Mississippi, but thin in a way that felt, to Diane's trained instinct, like the thinness of something that had been reduced rather than something that had always been sparse. No school enrollment records from any Bolivar County institution before the age of 9. A birth certificate with no subsequent administrative trail. No childhood contacts who had remained in Marcus's life or who were willing to speak to Diane's outreach. No family members on record beyond a deceased mother and an absent father. When she attempted to contact residents of Bolivar County, who might have had knowledge of the Cole family, she encountered a pattern of polite unavailability and conversations that ended before they should have in a way that was not, in her experience, the pattern of people with nothing to say, but the pattern of people who had been asked not to say it. Diane spent 6 weeks pursuing the story before she found Cynthia Watts, which required the kind of journalism that cannot be done from a desk. Driving to Mississippi in person, talking to people in the physical communities where the story had happened, following the chain of local memory that exists in small counties, and that opens, when it opens at all, to people who demonstrate that they already know enough to be trusted with more. Cynthia Watts was 73 years old and had lived 3 houses down from the Cole family on that Bolivar County street from 1975 through 1995, when she moved closer to her own children. She had known Alina. She had known Raymond. She had watched Marcus and Patricia and James and Rose grow up in the house that Alina ran with such particular warmth. She was not easy to find, but Diane found her, and Cynthia, who was old enough and had carried the weight of what she knew for long enough, agreed to talk. The conversation lasted 3 hours, and what it contained was the full shape of what had happened in August of 1981, including the parts that had never been in any record, and that Cynthia had held in private for 38 years. The night she saw Raymond's truck come back down the road without Marcus, the knock at her door, Raymond's shaking hands, the fragments of the story he told her in the way that people tell stories they are ashamed of, which is partially and out of order, and with the critical details delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. She told Diane about Harold Dunbar. She told Diane about the debts and the gambling and the months after Alina died. She told Diane about the specific threat Dunbar had made, not just the debt, not just the loss of property, but the explicit threat against the children in the house, the threat that had turned Raymond's terrible options into a terrible calculation. And she told Diane something that she had spent 38 years not being sure how to categorize, which was that when she saw Raymond Cole's face on the morning after Marcus left, the face she saw was not the face of a man who had been relieved of a burden. It was the face of a man who had just done something he understood he would never recover from, and who was already beginning the process of learning to carry it. Diane also found something else, through a combination of financial record examination and a source inside the Bolivar County medical system whose cooperation was not technically authorized, but whose motivations were not difficult to understand given the circumstances. Beginning in March of 2004 and continuing every single month for the following 15 years, regular anonymous cash payments had been made to a small medical clinic in Bolivar County on behalf of a patient identified in the billing records as R.E. Cole, Raymond Elijah Cole. The payments had covered everything: initial hospitalization, ongoing medication, specialist consultations, and eventually long-term residential care in the clinic's facility when Raymond's health deteriorated past the point of independent living. 15 years, more than $400,000. Anonymous. Originating, according to the financial source who traced it with considerable effort, from a private trust whose structure and whose legal representation, a Chicago firm called Castellan and Reed, pointed, when examined closely and with knowledge of Marcus Cole's corporate structure, toward one person and one person only. Diane Thornton sat with this information for 3 days. She called Marcus Cole's publicist and asked one question: had Marcus Cole had any contact with individuals in Bolivar County, Mississippi, in the past 20 years? And the publicist said no without hesitation in the tone of a prepared answer, and Diane heard the preparation in the no the way she always heard it, which was as an indication that she was very close to the thing that was actually true. What she was close to was the letter, and the letter is the pivot on which this entire story turns, the place where the two timelines, Marcus's interior life and the world's external understanding of Marcus, finally converge. Raymond Cole had written the letter in the spring of 2004, in a Mississippi clinic room, with hands compromised by illness and years of hard physical work, on 3 pages of plain-lined paper, in the labored handwriting of a man who did not write often, and who was applying to the act of writing the total concentration of someone who understands that this is probably the last significant thing they are going to say, and that it needs to be said correctly. The letter arrived at Marcus Cole's Chicago office in March of 2004, delivered through a mutual contact whose identity Marcus has never disclosed, in a plain envelope with no return address and a Bolivar County postmark. Marcus was sitting at his desk when it arrived, 32 years old, in the office he owned in the building he owned, with the city of Chicago doing its business 42 floors below him. He opened the envelope and took out the 3 pages and read them. He read them once, sitting at his desk. He put them in his inside jacket pocket and went to a meeting about a potential acquisition in the western suburbs. He came back from the meeting and sat at his desk and read the letter again. He did not call anyone. He did not discuss what he had read with his assistant or with Derek or with anyone at Castellan and Reed. He had a dinner commitment that evening, and he kept it, and he was, by the accounts of the people at that dinner, entirely present and attentive, which is either a testament to Marcus Cole's extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization or evidence that he was carrying the letter in a way that was so integrated with his breathing that it didn't surface as visible distress. He went home. Late that night, he got in his car and drove to the parking structure beneath his building, not for any practical reason, but because the underground quiet of the garage was the only space available to him. At that hour, and in that state, that had no demands in it, no social surface to maintain, no performance of competence to sustain. And he sat with the engine off under the flat fluorescent light and took the letter out and read it a third time. Raymond's letter said that he was dying, which he was. The lung disease had been progressing for 2 years, and the prognosis was measured now in months rather than years. And he had decided, in the time remaining to him, that there was one thing he needed to do before he ran out of time to do it. The letter said that Raymond had spent 23 years inside a relationship with the decision he made on that Tuesday night in August of 1981 that he could not accurately describe as either living with it or recovering from it. It was more like wearing it. He wrote, "The way you wear a thing that has been attached to you, and that is too large and too heavy, but that you have no mechanism for removing." The letter described Dunbar's visit. It described the threat in full, the explicitness of what Dunbar had said about the consequences for the family, the precision of the threat, the quality of Raymond's assessment in that moment that the threat was genuine and not a negotiating position. It described the hour Raymond had spent after Dunbar left, sitting in the kitchen with his 4 sleeping children in the house and his dead wife's absence in every corner of every room, trying to find a way through the situation that was not the way it ended. And then it described the way it ended, which Raymond did not soften or qualify or ask for understanding about, because understanding, he wrote, is not what Marcus deserves from me at this point. What you deserve is the true account, without my cleaning it up for my own comfort. Raymond wrote about the drive to the farm. He wrote about putting his hand on Marcus's head. He wrote about driving away. He wrote, in the most difficult passage in the letter, about what it felt like to drive back to a house that had Marcus's things in it. His notebooks, his school books, the blueprints he had been drawing in the margins, and to close the door on those things, and to tell Patricia and James and Rose that Marcus had gone to help on a farm for a while and that he would be back. And to watch the days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into the years in which Raymond Cole's life became the carrying of something that no amount of whiskey or poker could lighten, because Raymond had long since stopped drinking, stopped gambling, stopped everything that had produced the debt, and had taken on instead the particular burden of a man who is sober enough to see clearly exactly what he has done and what it cost. He wrote, "I do not ask you to forgive me. I am not entitled to ask you that. I am asking only that you know the full account, because I think you have been carrying a version of it that is worse than the true version, and if there is one thing I can give you at this point in either of our lives, it is the correct weight of what you have been carrying, which is not what Harold Dunbar told you it was." Marcus Cole sat in the parking garage under the fluorescent light and read those words, and he has described the experience of reading them. In the single interview where he discussed it, not as a revelation in the sharp, sudden sense that the word usually implies, but as a kind of slow structural rearrangement, the way a building settles when the load-bearing configuration is corrected rather than when the building falls. He had built 23 years of his interior life around the story Dunbar had told him, the story of a father who had not wanted him, who had been relieved to be rid of him, who had chosen this deliberately out of indifference. He had built the fury and the patience and the work and the distance on that foundation, and the foundation was not wrong exactly, because something terrible had happened, and someone was responsible for it, but it was incomplete, and the incompleteness had given the structure a specific lean that Marcus recognized, sitting in that garage, as the lean of a person who has been carrying the wrong weight in the wrong direction for a very long time. He sat there for a long time, longer than he has ever specified. And when he left the garage and drove home, he had made one decision, which was the decision to pay Raymond Cole's medical bills, and that was all. He did not decide to forgive. He did not decide to contact Raymond. He did not decide to tell anyone what the letter had contained. He decided to pay the bills, and he did, through Castellan and Reed, in a structure that was designed to be untraceable unless someone looked very carefully, which Diane Thornton eventually did. He also made another decision, in March of 2004, that he did not discuss with anyone for 15 years, and that he mentioned in a small Baptist church in Bolivar County, only because he was standing in front of people who had lived under the weight of Harold Dunbar's presence for decades, and who deserved, in Marcus's assessment, to know that the weight had been deliberately lifted. He contacted the attorney at Castellan and read who handled his legal matters, and provided instructions for the filing of a federal complaint against Harold Dunbar's labor operation, on behalf of an unnamed client, through channels that were legally insulated from Marcus's name in a way that required considerable care to construct, but that were designed to be effective. The complaint alleged federal labor violations, the specific violations that 7 years of observation from the inside of Dunbar's operation had given Marcus the precise knowledge to document. The complaint triggered an investigation by federal labor authorities beginning in the spring of 2004. The investigation proceeded over the following year, examining Dunbar's operations, his contracts, his financial relationships with the farm owners who had used his labor supply across 3 counties over 20 years. In 2005, Harold Dunbar was indicted on federal labor violations. His assets were seized. His operation was shut down. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. He served the sentence and was released and died in 2013, at 79 years old, with nothing, no assets, no operation, no leverage over anyone, no property to leave. The man who had run those 3 Delta counties for 20 years, and who had used the specific vulnerabilities of desperate people to build a sustainable business out of human suffering, ended his life as a quiet, empty accounting, which is not justice in any full or satisfying sense, but which is, in Marcus Cole's word, a correction. The system had been corrected. The operation was gone. And Marcus Cole's name was attached to none of it, because the effectiveness of what he did required the anonymity of it, and because Marcus Cole, by 2004, was very good at being effective in ways that did not require visibility. Raymond Cole died on October 9, 2019, at 78 years old in the clinic room in Bolivar County, where he had been a residential patient for 6 years. His death came at the end of a long decline that everyone who knew him had been watching for years, and it was not sudden in the physical sense. Marcus received the call on the morning of October 9th at his Chicago office, before his workday had properly begun. He took the call in private. He came back into the open office with his expression unchanged and his bearing composed, and the colleagues who were present described him as quieter than usual that morning, which was the only external indicator of what he was carrying. 2 days later, he boarded a plane to Mississippi. He told his office he was traveling for personal reasons and gave no further detail. He arrived in Bolivar County on the afternoon of October 13th and stayed the night at a small motel in the county seat. And the following morning, he put on a dark suit and drove to Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church for the 9 o'clock funeral service of his father. 53 people attended Raymond Cole's funeral, most of them elderly residents of the county who had known Raymond across the decades in various configurations. The young veteran who came home different, the widower who withdrew after a leaner's death, the quiet man who had lived out his last years in a clinic bed, and who had, in the estimation of the people who visited him there, found some version of accommodation with himself in those final years that made him easier to be around than he had been in the decades before. Several of them recognized Marcus Cole when he came into the church and took the last pew, and the recognition moved through the room the way recognition moves through a contained space. Silently, completely, leaving a trail of turned heads and widened eyes, and the particular hush of a community unexpectedly in the presence of someone whose departure it had witnessed, and whose return it had not anticipated. Marcus sat quietly through the opening hymns and the scripture readings, and the pastor's reflection on Raymond Cole's life, which was careful and generous, and did not avoid the difficulties, but framed them in the language of a faith that believes in the possibility of a person finding their way back from their worst acts, if not all the way home then, at least to something that looks like the approaching edge of home. And then, without announcement, without preparation, without anyone asking him to, Marcus Cole stood up from the last pew and walked to the front of the church. The pastor stepped aside. Marcus stood at the front of the room and looked at the people there, and then he spoke, and what he said in the 11 minutes that followed was the most public and the most private thing he had ever said, and it was heard by 53 people in a small church in Bolivar County, Mississippi, and it was written down by 5 of them from memory before the day was over. And it was the truest account anyone has ever given of what it costs to survive what Marcus Cole survived, and what it costs to understand, fully and without softening, the person who put you in the position of having to survive it. He told them what had happened, not in the summary way of someone managing the information, but in the full, specific way of someone who has decided that the people in this room deserve the whole thing. He told them about the morning, the breakfast, the drive down Highway 61, the gravel road, his father's hand on top of his head. He told them about Harold Dunbar's farm, about the work and the isolation and the years. He told them about the lie Dunbar had told him about Raymond, and he said it plainly. He said this was a lie, and that he had believed it for most of his adult life, and that the believing of it had shaped him in ways he was still accounting for. He told them about Walter and the books and the dirt blueprints. He told them about the flood and the freight car and Chicago. He told them about the letter. He said he had received a letter from his father in 2004, and that the letter had given him the full picture for the first time. And that the full picture was different in important ways from the picture Dunbar had given him at 9 years old, and that sitting with the full picture had taken more time and more interior work than anything he had done in a business context, which was saying something. And then he said the thing that the 5 people who wrote it down from memory all wrote down in almost exactly the same words, which is evidence that it was said exactly as they recorded it, without the variations that memory usually introduces. He said, "I have not come here to forgive my father, because my father does not need my forgiveness where he is now. I have come because he was my father, and this is where you come when your father dies, and because I believe that the people in this room deserve to know who Raymond Cole actually was. He was a broken man who did a devastating thing in a desperate moment to protect the children he loved. That is not a defense. It is a description. And the description matters, because Raymond Cole was a human being and not a cartoon, and the truth about human beings is always more complicated than the stories we tell about them to make the complicated things simpler. I am not grateful for what happened to me, but I am, at this point in my life, at peace with the man who set it in motion. Those are not the same thing, and I think the difference between them is the most important thing I have learned in 50 years of being alive." He mentioned Harold Dunbar. He explained the operation and the federal complaint and the prosecution. He said it without triumph and without the satisfaction of a score settled, because Marcus Cole, by 2019, was past the part of his life where satisfaction of that kind was available to him. He said what he said about Dunbar, because the people in those 3 Delta counties deserved to know that the instrument of their longtime exposure had been dismantled by one of the people it had damaged, and that the dismantling had been accomplished not through the visible and dramatic means that stories of revenge usually employ, but through the patient, anonymous, legally meticulous means of a person who understood that effectiveness was more important than visibility, and that justice, when the formal systems are insufficient to deliver it, sometimes requires the work of the individual operating at the boundary of what the available tools allow. He said, "I did what I could do with what I had." And then he sat back down in the last pew, and the pastor gave the benediction, and the service ended, and the people filed out into the October Mississippi light, and several of them stood for a long time on the church steps without speaking, which was the appropriate response to what they had just heard. Cynthia Watts was there that day, and she approached Marcus on the church steps after most of the other people had drifted away, and she took his hands in both of hers and held them for a moment without saying anything, and Marcus held hers, and they stood there in the October light in a silence that Cynthia later described as the kind of silence that is full rather than empty, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because what it is holding is already present and complete. Then she said something to him in a voice too low for anyone nearby to hear, and whatever she said produced a response in Marcus's face that the 2 or 3 people close enough to observe it have described in similar terms. A small, brief, almost involuntary softening, the expression of a person receiving something they have been waiting a very long time for, something that arrives finally not as the dramatic event the waiting made you expect, but as a quiet, ordinary sentence. Said by an old woman on a church step in the fall, that somehow contains everything that all the years were about. We do not know what Cynthia Watts said to Marcus Cole on those church steps on October 14th, 2019. Neither of them has disclosed it. What we know is that they stood there for a moment with their hands linked, and then Marcus nodded, and Cynthia nodded, and they both let go. And Marcus walked to his rental car and drove away from Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church and back toward the motel, and then the airport, and then the 42-story building in Chicago where the life he had built was waiting for him. Harold Dunbar died in federal custody in March of 2013 at 79 years old, with the specific diminishment of a man who had spent a lifetime accumulating leverage over other people and had run out of other people to leverage. His farm was sold at federal auction. His financial assets were applied to the judgment against him. He died in the care of a federal medical facility with no assets and no visitors and no record of ever having acknowledged, in any documented context, that what he had done across 20 years of operation in those 3 Mississippi counties was anything other than a business arrangement that had run into regulatory difficulties. This is the part of the story where most people expect to feel something clean, satisfaction, or relief, or the particular pleasure of a reckoning arrived at. Marcus Cole felt something he described as a correction. Not a balance, not a settlement, not a satisfaction, a correction. The system that had functioned incorrectly for 20 years had been adjusted. The damage that the incorrect functioning had produced was not undone. The correction was real and it mattered, but it was a different category of thing from justice. And Marcus Cole, who is precise in his language about things that matter to him, does not use the word justice about what happened to Harold Dunbar. Marcus Cole established the Billionaire Foundation in 2020, nomming it for his mother with a quiet intentionality that required no explanation to anyone who knew the full story, and that was entirely self-explanatory to anyone who didn't. The foundation funds education programs across 8 American states, with a focus specifically on children in the foster care system and in rural agricultural communities. The communities that look, in various ways, like the communities that produced Marcus Cole and that are structured, whether by design or by neglect, to extract labor from children rather than invest in the potential that those children contain. The foundation has, in its first 5 years, provided educational support and resources to over 40,000 young people. Marcus sits on the board and is not a ceremonial presence on it. He attends the meetings, knows the programs, engages with the outcomes data with the same analytical rigor he applies to his investment decisions. He named it after a leaner because the capacity to keep going after you have lost the most important thing, which is what Marcus did, and what a significant number of the children the foundation serves have also done, was something he understood at 8 years old at the graveside of a woman who had installed that capacity in him before she ran out of time to see what he would do with it. And he wanted that installation to mean something in the world. To have consequences that extended past the person who received it, because that is what love does when it is given well. It compounds, the way capital compounds when it is invested rather than spent, extending beyond the original transaction into a future the original investor did not live to see. In the summer of 2022, Marcus Cole drove to Bolivar County for the second time in his adult life. He drove down Highway 61 and turned onto the gravel road and came out through the water oaks into the property that had been Harold Dunbar's operation. The farmhouse was still standing under different ownership, having changed hands twice since the federal seizure. The fields were planted, soybeans, the same as they had always been, because the Delta grows soybeans and cotton, and the reasons for that have not changed in the decades since Marcus Cole worked those rows. The bunkhouse was gone, replaced by a storage structure, and the concrete pad where it had stood had grass pushing through the cracks in the particular insistence of living things reclaiming spaces that were not designed for them. Marcus parked the car at the edge of the gravel road, not quite at the spot where Raymond's truck had stopped in 1981, but close, and got out and stood in the August heat and looked at the property for a while. He said, in the 2021 interview where he described his intention to return, that he had expected to feel something decisive when he stood there. some version of the dramatic emotional reckoning that the full narrative of his relationship to this place seemed to demand. What he actually felt, he said, was quieter and more honest than that. He said it was just a field. He said the field did not have a relationship to him beyond the one he brought to it, and that the relationship he brought to it was complete, not healed. Not resolved in any clean sense, but complete in the way that something is complete when all of its elements have been acknowledged, and none of them have been falsified, and the person carrying them has found a way to carry them that does not require the falsification to work. He stood there for a while. He got back in the car. He drove north, toward the highway, toward the airport, toward Chicago, toward the 42-story building and the margin drawings and the work that is always, in some form, still the work of that 9-year-old boy who believed that the structures holding the world upright could be understood and built and maintained, and who turned out, despite everything that was done to make him believe otherwise, to be right. Marcus Cole is 53 years old. He is still building. He still draws in the margins of his meeting notebooks, structures of various kinds, the habit of a mind that thinks natively in terms of what holds things up and what needs reinforcement, and where the load is distributed, and whether the distribution is adequate for what the structure is being asked to bear. He is, by every account of the people who work with him, and the people who have competed against him, and the people who have sat across a table from him in the various contexts that a person worth $3.4 billion occupies, exactly what he appears to be, which is unusual in an environment where the gap between appearance. And that is Marcus Cole, sold for $800, worth $3.4 billion. If this story hit you the way we think it did, do not just sit there. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications, because next week we have another story that is going to do exactly what this one just did to you, and you cannot afford to miss it. Now drop a comment below. Tell us the one moment in this story that stopped you cold. Was it the gravel road? Was it the letter? Was it the funeral speech? Tell us right now, because we read every single comment. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this story, a friend, a family member, somebody going through something hard right now, share this video with them today. Not tomorrow, today. Because some stories have the power to change the way a person sees their own life. And this is one of them. Part 1 is on your screen right now. Watch it, and we will see you next week.